They say that in a small town, the law is only as fair as the man who enforces it. For 40 years, Arthur Vance believed the dirt beneath his boots was his ultimate security. He knew the borders of his property not by looking at a map, but by the calluses on his hands. He had cleared the timber, reinforced the drainage ditches, and paid his property taxes on the first Tuesday of every single November. But on a crisp Tuesday morning, none of those 40 years mattered. A single piece of paper, stamped with the municipal seal of Oak Creek and signed by Mayor Richard Sterling, effectively erased his life's work. The notice didn't ask Arthur to sell, it informed him that his land now belonged to the city under an emergency declaration of eminent domain. It was a calculated, cold-blooded legal ambush, executed before Arthur could even finish his morning coffee. The confrontation began not with a negotiation, but with the flashing lights of a county cruiser. Sheriff Deputy Marcus Miller, a man Arthur had known since childhood, didn't step out of his vehicle with a smile. He stepped out holding a clipboard and a court-ordered injunction. The contrast was stark. On one side stood a man in mud-caked denim who had spent his entire life producing food for the county, on the other stood the cold mechanism of local governance, weaponized to strip him of his livelihood. The justification printed on the document was intentionally vague, citing municipal infrastructure optimization and public safety corridor development. To the average citizen, it sounded like necessary progress. To Arthur, it sounded like a death sentence for his farm. The town claimed they needed his northern 60 acres for a vital highway bypass, a project the city council had suddenly fast-tracked during a closed-door session just 3 nights prior. Arthur tried to argue, his voice steady but laced with the deep, burning frustration of a man realizing the system he trusted had turned against him. He pointed out that his family had held the deed since the late 1930s, that the soil was prime agricultural land, and that diverting a highway through his property would completely destroy the natural watershed, ruining the remaining acreage. The deputy simply shook his head, refusing to meet Arthur's eyes, and pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. Mayor Sterling's handwriting was bold and aggressive, a perfect reflection of the man himself. Sterling had run for office on a platform of economic revitalization, promising to put Oak Creek on the map by attracting major retail developers and corporate logistics hubs. What he hadn't mentioned during his campaign speeches was that his definition of revitalization involved crushing anyone who stood in the path of his favored developers. By noon, the physical reality of the seizure began. Heavy yellow machinery from a private contracting firm, owned by one of the mayor's primary campaign contributors, rolled past the broken wooden gate. Arthur could only watch from his porch as the bulldozers tore through the outer fence line, the very fence he had repaired by hand the previous spring. The local police department set up temporary barricades at the edge of his driveway, explicitly warning him that stepping past the perimeter would result in an immediate arrest for obstructing a municipal project. The speed of the operation was terrifyingly efficient, designed specifically to prevent Arthur from obtaining a temporary restraining order or securing legal counsel before the physical landscape was permanently altered. It was a classic local government power play: destroy the property first, and let the victim spend years trying to sue for damages in a local court system controlled by the very people who ordered the destruction. Arthur didn't panic, nor did he resort to useless threats of violence. He understood that fighting a corrupt local system required strategy, not anger. He spent the evening at his kitchen table, surrounded by decades of tax receipts, land surveys, and water rights documentation. He began looking for the cracks in the city's narrative. The sheer speed of the seizure was their vulnerability. In their haste to clear the land and present the project as a done deal, the mayor's office had inevitably cut corners. Local municipal codes required a 30-day public comment period and an independent environmental impact assessment before eminent domain could be triggered for public infrastructure. The city had bypassed these steps by declaring an imminent public safety necessity, claiming the current commercial traffic routing posed an immediate danger to the town's central district. The next morning, Arthur walked into the offices of the only independent legal aid in the county, a sharp, cynical attorney named Clara Reyes who specialized in administrative law. Clara reviewed the paperwork with a practiced, weary eye. She didn't offer any false hope or comforting platitudes. She told Arthur bluntly that fighting eminent domain in a local jurisdiction was an uphill battle. The local circuit court judge was a close political ally of Mayor Sterling, and any standard appeal would likely sit on a docket for months, if not years, while the bulldozers continued their work. However, Clara noticed something peculiar in the financing section of the city's public notice. To fund the initial site clearing and engineering assessments, the city hadn't relied solely on municipal bonds. They had applied for and received a specialized development grant from a higher authority. This single detail changed the entire nature of the conflict, transforming a localized land grab into something far more dangerous for the administration at City Hall. The true nature of Mayor Sterling's grand design became clear over the next 48 hours, not through official press releases, but through the shifting of surveyors' stakes. Arthur watched from his truck as the engineers moved past the designated highway corridor and began marking out boundaries that resembled a massive commercial grid rather than a public transport bypass. It was Clara Reyes who uncovered the missing puzzle piece through a routine check of the county's commercial real estate registry. The land adjacent to Arthur's farm had been quietly purchased 3 months earlier by an anonymous Delaware-based limited liability company. With a bit of digging through state corporate filings, Clara traced the ownership of that shell corporation back to a real estate holding firm owned entirely by the mayor's brother-in-law, a prominent regional developer named Greg Vance, no relation to Arthur, but a man well known for turning rural acreage into lucrative strip malls. The strategy was as old as municipal corruption itself. By using the guise of a public infrastructure project, the city could legally seize Arthur's land at a fraction of its actual market value under the pretext of public utility. Once the land was cleared, graded, and connected to the municipal sewer system using taxpayer money, the city council intended to declare the highway project financially unfeasible due to unforeseen geological constraints. At that point, the land would be declared municipal surplus and sold off at a heavily discounted rate to the highest bidder, which, by design, would be the mayor's brother-in-law's development firm. The farm would be replaced by a sprawling commercial plaza, a luxury hotel, and a private logistics hub, netting the conspirators millions of dollars while Arthur was left with a meager payout that wouldn't cover the cost of a down payment on a new tractor. Armed with this evidence of a clear conflict of interest, Clara filed an emergency motion for an injunction in the county circuit court, seeking a temporary restraining order to halt the demolition until a full evidentiary hearing could be conducted. The response from the local legal system was swift, predictable, and devastatingly cold. Judge Thomas Miller, a man who shared a weekly golf game with Mayor Sterling and whose campaign finances were deeply intertwined with the local business coalition, denied the motion without even granting Clara an oral argument. The written denial stated that the plaintiff had failed to demonstrate irreparable harm, and that the public interest in executing the infrastructure project outweighed any private property concerns. The local courts had closed their doors in Arthur's face, proving that within the borders of Oak Creek, the mayor's word was absolute law. Flushed with their easy victory in court, the mayor's office grew increasingly arrogant. That afternoon, Mayor Sterling himself arrived at the edge of Arthur's property, accompanied by a local news crew. It was a calculated public relations stunt designed to frame Arthur as a stubborn, backward obstructionist who was standing in the way of progress, jobs, and lower property taxes for the hardworking families of the town. Sterling stood before the cameras, gesturing toward the idling bulldozers, speaking smoothly about the inevitable march of progress and how difficult but necessary choices had to be made for the greater good of Oak Creek. When Arthur refused to come out to give them a soundbite, the mayor smiled directly into the camera, stating that the city had acted entirely within its legal rights and that the transition of ownership was now a closed chapter. But the mayor had made one fatal miscalculation: he assumed Arthur would play by his rules within his sandbox. That evening, sitting in Clara's cramped office surrounded by the city's financial disclosures, they looked away from the local statutes and focused entirely on the source of the project's funding. To fast-track the project, Sterling hadn't just used local taxpayer dollars, he had secured a $1.5 million federal infrastructure integration grant designed to assist rural communities in connecting agricultural shipping routes to interstate highways. By mixing federal funds with local municipal funds to execute the land seizure, the mayor had inadvertently opened a door he could never close. He had subjected his small-town operation to the rigorous, uncompromising oversight of the United States government. Clara drafted a comprehensive, evidence-heavy complaint detailing the clear conflict of interest, the immediate rezoning discrepancies, and the blatant violation of federal procurement procedures. She didn't send it to the local police, the county prosecutor, or the state attorney general, all of whom operated within the same political network as Mayor Sterling. Instead, she uploaded the complete digital dossier directly to the secure portal of the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Transportation and the Government Accountability Office. Arthur knew it was a long shot. The federal bureaucracy was massive, slow-moving, and often indifferent to the struggles of individual citizens. But it was his only remaining option. As the sun set over his half-demolished northern pasture, Arthur signed his name to the federal whistleblower affidavit, knowing that if this failed, his family's legacy was gone forever. The transition from a local property dispute to a matter of federal interest didn't happen with the dramatic flair of a television broadcast. It began with the quiet, methodical analysis of data. In Washington, D.C., the Office of the Inspector General receives thousands of complaints a week. But Arthur and Clara's submission stood out for one specific reason: it contained undeniable proof of data manipulation. To secure the federal infrastructure grant, the Oak Creek City Council had been required to submit a comprehensive traffic density study and an independent environmental impact report. Clara had meticulously cross-referenced the documents the city submitted to the federal database with the internal municipal records she obtained through a series of aggressively timed Freedom of Information Act requests. The discrepancies were glaring. The city's official submission to the federal government claimed that the current routing of commercial agricultural trucks through the town center had caused a 40% increase in heavy vehicle accidents over the last 3 fiscal years. However, the local police department's internal incident logs, which Arthur had obtained through a retired desk sergeant who despised the mayor's corrupt practices, showed a completely different reality. Heavy vehicle accidents had actually decreased by 12%. The mayor's office had simply fabricated the safety data to satisfy the emergency criteria required for the federal grant. Furthermore, the environmental assessment submitted by the city claimed the northern 60 acres of Arthur's property consisted primarily of low-yield, degraded soil with no significant ecological value. In reality, State Agricultural Extension Services had classified Arthur's land as Grade A prime topsoil, situated directly over a critical subterranean aquifer that supplied water to 3 neighboring townships. For 2 weeks, nothing seemed to change on the ground. The bulldozers continued their slow, destructive march across Arthur's northern pasture, tearing up topsoil that had taken generations to cultivate and laying down thick layers of crushed limestone for the foundations of the planned bypass. The local newspaper, completely dependent on the city's legal advertising revenue for its financial survival, ran a series of articles praising Mayor Sterling's visionary leadership and projecting millions of dollars in new commercial growth. Arthur was widely viewed by the town's business community as a bitter holdout, a relic of an older era who was selfishly impeding the economic modernization of Oak Creek. He was forced to endure the whispers at the local grocery store and the deliberate avoidance of neighbors who feared political retaliation from City Hall if they were seen associating with him. Throughout this period of intense isolation, Arthur remained entirely disciplined. He didn't engage in public arguments, he didn't post angry rants on social media, and he didn't attempt to physically block the construction equipment. He knew that any emotional outburst would immediately be weaponized against him by the mayor's public relations apparatus to secure a permanent criminal restraining order, which would legally bar him from even approaching his own property lines. Instead, every single morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Arthur walked down his driveway to the edge of the construction zone with a high-definition digital camera and a notebook. He documented every single vehicle that entered the site, noting the corporate logos on the doors, the license plate numbers, and the specific tasks they were performing. His meticulous record-keeping paid off when he noticed that the equipment clearing his land didn't belong to the Municipal Public Works Department, nor did it belong to the primary contractor listed on the federal grant approval documents. The machinery belonged to a secondary subcontractor, Vanguard Earthworks LLC. A quick search of the state's corporate database revealed that Vanguard Earthworks had been incorporated just 24 days before the city council approved the eminent domain seizure. The registered agent for the LLC was none other than the mayor's personal tax accountant, and the majority shareholder was a blind trust managed by the mayor's wife. The corruption wasn't just systemic, it was incredibly sloppy, driven by the absolute certainty that no one in a town of 8,000 people would ever have the resources, the legal acumen, or the sheer courage to look beneath the surface. On a Thursday afternoon, while Mayor Sterling was hosting a private luncheon at the local country club for a group of out-of-town commercial real estate investors, a plain, unmarked dark gray sedan pulled into the parking lot of the Oak Creek Municipal Building. 2 individuals stepped out of the vehicle. They weren't wearing tactical gear, and they didn't carry weapons. They carried heavy leather briefcases and federal identification badges issued by the United States Department of Transportation. Leading the pair was senior federal auditor Franklin Vance, coincidentally sharing a common surname with Arthur, though they were entirely unrelated by blood. Franklin was a 20-year veteran of the Regulatory Oversight Division, a man whose entire career was dedicated to dismantling the exact type of casual, small-town financial fraud that Mayor Sterling had spent years perfecting. Without any prior announcement or courtesy notification to the mayor's office, the federal auditors walked past the receptionist, showed their credentials to the city administrator, and demanded immediate, unredacted access to the municipal financial archives. The arrival of the federal oversight team transformed the atmosphere inside the Oak Creek Municipal Building from a quiet, sleepy bureaucracy into an absolute pressure cooker within a matter of minutes. When the city administrator initially attempted to stall, claiming that the requested financial ledgers and procurement records were archived off-site and would require a formal written request with a 14-day processing window, Senior Auditor Franklin Vance didn't engage in an argument. He merely opened his briefcase, extracted a federal administrative subpoena signed by a United States district judge, and placed it calmly on the front desk. The document explicitly stated that any deliberate delay, withholding of documentation, or alteration of municipal records would immediately be treated as federal obstruction of justice, carrying severe criminal penalties. Within 20 minutes, the city's IT director was instructed to provision a dedicated secure terminal for the federal team, giving them unrestricted access to every digital transaction, email archive, and bank wire transfer executed by the town over the past 48 months. When Mayor Sterling received an emergency text message from his assistant, he abruptly cut short his presentation to the real estate investors at the country club, leaving his lunch untouched. He arrived at City Hall 40 minutes later, his face flushed with a mixture of intense anger and mounting panic. He stormed into the conference room where the auditors had set up their mobile command center, demanding to know why a federal agency was interfering in a purely local infrastructure matter that had already been thoroughly reviewed and validated by a county circuit court judge. Sterling attempted to use the same aggressive, folksy charisma that had allowed him to dominate local politics for a decade. He laughed off the allegations, suggesting that the federal government was wasting valuable taxpayer resources based on the bitter, baseless complaints of a single disgruntled farmer who simply didn't want a modern highway passing near his property line. Franklin Vance didn't look up from his laptop screen while the mayor spoke. He allowed Sterling to exhaust his bluster before lifting his head and turning a completely expressionless gaze toward the politician. The contrast between the two men was absolute. Sterling was loud, theatrical, and sweating through his expensive tailored suit, while Vance was entirely composed, operating with the terrifying, mathematical precision of a seasoned forensic accountant. Vance didn't mention Arthur's farm, nor did he discuss local politics. Instead, he pulled up a copy of the federal grant disbursement ledger on a large projector screen and began listing a sequence of wire transfers that had occurred over the past 90 days. He asked the mayor to explain why $500,000 of federal infrastructure funds, specifically earmarked for municipal utility integration, had been transferred within 48 hours of receipt into an escrow account held by Vanguard Earthworks LLC, a company with zero historical track record in public works construction. The mayor's voice faltered. He stammered an explanation about emergency subcontracting procedures and the necessity of securing heavy equipment on short notice due to supply chain constraints. But Vance was already clicking to the next slide. He presented an encrypted email thread retrieved directly from the city's main server, dated 6 weeks prior to the eminent domain declaration. The emails were between Mayor Sterling, his brother-in-law Greg Vance, and the city's chief zoning commissioner. The subject line read, Oak Creek North Commercial Grid Corridor Development. In those messages, the mayor explicitly outlined a timeline to use federal safety grants to clear Arthur's land, build the heavy vehicle foundations, and then intentionally cancel the highway project due to a fabricated soil instability report, thereby clearing the way for his brother-in-law's private commercial development to buy the property for pennies on the dollar. While this intense interrogation was unfolding inside City Hall, a second federal investigator arrived at Arthur's farm, accompanied by an independent engineering surveyor from the State Department of Transportation. They ordered the private contractors clearing the land to immediately shut down their bulldozer engines and step away from the machinery. The site foreman tried to protest, waving the county court order signed by Judge Miller, but the federal agent simply informed him that all work on the project was officially suspended under a federal administrative stop work order, pending the outcome of an active investigation into Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations regarding the misappropriation of grant funds. For the first time in weeks, the deafening roar of diesel engines ceased, and an incredible, profound silence returned to Arthur's northern pasture. Arthur walked down from his porch, meeting the federal agent at the perimeter fence. There were no grand declarations or celebrations. The investigator simply took a formal, detailed statement from Arthur, verified the daily logs and photographic evidence Arthur had compiled, and confirmed that the physical data matched the digital discrepancies they had uncovered in Washington. The entire local apparatus that Mayor Sterling had spent years constructing, the complicit local courts, the funded police presence, the controlled local media, was completely paralyzed the moment the federal government asserted its superior jurisdiction. The paper fence the mayor had built to trap Arthur had suddenly transformed into a legal cage around City Hall, and the bars were rapidly tightening. The fallout from the federal audit was swift, systematic, and completely devastating to the political machine that had governed Oak Creek for a decade. By the following Monday, the Office of the Inspector General, in coordination with the Department of Justice, issued a formal administrative freeze on all federal financial allocations to the municipality. The town's primary bank accounts, which held millions of dollars in various federal infrastructure, educational, and agricultural development grants, were completely locked down pending a full forensic accounting. This move single-handedly paralyzed the city's financial operational capabilities. Without access to these critical funds, the city council found itself facing an immediate, catastrophic fiscal crisis, unable to fund routine municipal services or pay the salaries of city employees, including the very police officers who had been deployed to guard Arthur's seized land. Realizing that the ship was sinking, the members of the Oak Creek City Council rapidly turned on Mayor Sterling to save themselves from potential federal criminal indictments. During an emergency public session that drew hundreds of furious local residents, the council voted unanimously to strip the mayor of his administrative authority over all ongoing infrastructure projects. The city attorney, who had previously assisted in drafting the eminent domain paperwork, submitted a formal confession to federal investigators, admitting that the entire highway bypass project was a fabricated pretext designed specifically to enrich the mayor's brother-in-law and his political contributors. The local circuit court judge, Thomas Miller, hastily recused himself from all pending civil litigation related to Arthur's property, effectively nullifying his previous denial of the injunction and leaving the city with zero legal defense. A federal grand jury in the state capital subsequently handed down a multi-count indictment against Richard Sterling and his brother-in-law, Greg Vance. The charges included federal wire fraud, conspiracy to misappropriate federal grant funds, extortion under color of official right, and the falsification of official data submitted to a federal agency. The smooth, arrogant politician who had stood before news cameras proclaiming the inevitable march of progress was photographed leaving his office in handcuffs, escorted by federal marshals. The private contracting firm, Vanguard Earthworks LLC, was placed into federal receivership, its heavy machinery seized as evidence of a criminal enterprise. The elaborate web of corruption that had seemed so permanent and insurmountable to the ordinary citizens of Oak Creek was completely dismantled in less than 30 days by the uncompromising enforcement of federal administrative law. For Arthur Vance, the resolution arrived not with a financial windfall, but with the simple restoration of what was rightfully his. The interim city administration, desperate to avoid a massive federal civil rights and property damage lawsuit, entered into a formal settlement agreement with Arthur and his attorney, Clara Reyes. The city completely rescinded the eminent domain declaration, formally restoring Arthur's undisputed deed and title to the northern 60 acres. Furthermore, under the strict supervision of the federal auditors, the city was forced to utilize its remaining municipal contingency funds to pay for the complete environmental remediation of Arthur's pasture. A specialized agricultural restoration firm was hired to remove the limestone foundations, replace the excavated topsoil with certified prime organic dirt, and replant the native grasses that had been destroyed by the bulldozers. On a warm evening late in the summer, Arthur stood on his front porch, looking out over his northern pasture. The heavy machinery was gone, replaced by the quiet, rhythmic sound of crickets and the rustle of wind through the newly seeded grass. The land bore a few physical scars where the bulldozers had dug deep, but the soil was his once more, and it would heal over time. The contrast between his small-town reality and the massive federal apparatus that had saved him was profound. He hadn't won his battle by using anger, violence, or political influence. He had won it by remaining entirely disciplined, documenting the facts, and knowing exactly when to step outside a corrupt local system to call upon a higher, unyielding authority. The story of Oak Creek became a cautionary tale whispered in municipal buildings across the state. It served as a stark, powerful reminder to small-town politicians who believed their local power was absolute, no matter how high your office, no matter how many local judges you have in your pocket, and no matter how easily you can bully an ordinary citizen, the law is a double-edged sword. And when you misuse federal resources to execute a personal vendetta against a private landowner, the system you weaponized will eventually turn around and crush you. Arthur walked down his driveway, closed the heavy wooden gate that had once been smashed open, and latched it shut. For 40 years, he had protected this land, and tonight, the land was finally at peace.